For what is now a relatively small part of Britain, the Welsh are at the very heart of British history. The legends of King Arthur, though now popular among English, began as Welsh tales of a king who fought against the Anglo-Saxons. Wales has beautiful mountains, breathtaking coasts, castles, sheep, and totally unpronounceable names like Llanfair Pwysgringis Goger Uchwern Drobus Llantysilio Gogogoch, said in the tongue of one of the last surviving Celtic languages. Since 1301, the heir apparent to the English throne has been titled Prince of Wales. Why is this western fringe of Britain so important to the origins of Britain and to its monarchy? We will peer behind the veil of Arthurian myth, histories of Roman Britain, and archaeology to find out who are the Welsh. Hi friends, I'm Kevin McLean. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, and consider supporting me on Patreon, PayPal, or now directly through YouTube. Your support helps me to continue to make content like this. Much thanks to all of my supporters. The Welsh are known in their own language as the Cymru. The name for the country, Cymru, comes from the plural form of an early Proto-Brythonic Combrogos, meaning compatriots or countrymen. The name Cambria is the Latinized version of this name, and it was used by the people to refer to themselves as an ethnic group, as well as the lands which they occupied, at least since the 7th century, though very likely even before this. The origin of the name Welsh comes from an Old English word, Welas, inherited into Proto-Germanic from a name for a Gaulish tribe, the Volcae, who bordered Germanic regions. It was used to denote a foreigner, and perhaps specifically Romanized ones. In Old Norse, Valskr referred to French. Within their own ancestral island, the Cymru came to be called foreigners. Cymraeg, the name of the language, along with Breton, are surviving descendants of the tongue once spoken across almost all of Britain, known as Common Brythonic. Though there has been wide debate about when and how the Celtic language came to Britain, recent genetic studies paired with linguistic analysis suggest a late Bronze Age date, tied to movements of people originating in Central and Western Europe, possibly related to the Urnfield culture. During this period, the Celtic language spread through western France and into Iberia, south into northern Italy, and north across the Channel into Britain and Ireland. This spread was facilitated by population migration combined with elite dominance. In Britain and Ireland, a Celtic-speaking elite took possession of the land, most likely through the institution of the young male warrior bands common across Indo-European society, and which persisted in the Gaelic traditions of the Fianna. This Celtic migration did not affect all places equally, however. Mainland Celtic immigration into Ireland appears to have been relatively limited, based on present genetic findings, pointing to a small elite takeover that spread the language and customs of elite society among an already very similar Indo-European originated Bell Beaker population. Many local customs appear to have been relatively unchanged. In Britain, however, a larger shift occurred, reflecting a larger Celtic immigration from the mainland, certainly due to their proximity. Within the historical period, we are informed by Roman writers that there were close links between a number of British and Gaulish tribes. During Julius Caesar's war in Gaul, a number of Gaulish tribes and individual bands fled into Britain, We also see that a number of tribal names appear similar or are the same as their Gaulish counterparts. Caesar recorded that the Druids of Gaul used to receive teaching in Britain, where they believed that their order originated. This may provide evidence for a degree of mutual intelligibility between Gaulish and Brythonic at that time, or bilingualism, and the belief that both languages and people were anciently related. Though the Brythonic language shares certain features with the Goidelic, such that they are grouped together as insular Celtic languages, Brythonic also has features of the Gaulish language, and these elements are primarily what separate it from Irish. Though Proto-Celtic did not retain the Indo-European P sound, both Gaulish and Brythonic adopted it, creating the distinction known as P-Celtic and Q-Celtic. How and when this happened is a matter of debate, but shows that Brythonic was under heavy Gaulish influence. This seems to have extended even into the north. Pictish, for instance, shows several signs of having been P-Celtic, with numerous place names containing the word pit. Welsh history begins with the earliest history of the British Isles. Unlike the Picts, whose ancient independent identity was largely destroyed by the Gaels and the English, a continuous Welsh identity has endured, consciously linked to the Iron Age British leaders who fought against the Romans. Though it can be argued that much of what the medieval Welsh knew about that history came from Roman writers, they recognized themselves as the descendants of those people. And from the fragments of folklore that survive, we can see that there was a lively folk history of the period, which told of fictional events such as Castelvolana sneaking into the camp of Julius Caesar as a shoemaker in order to win back his love, Fleur, whom the emperor had taken. Such a story likely plays off the myths of Celtic gods. Though the Welsh trace their identity back to the Iron Age British, that identity was not politically unified. A good comparison for it is the classical Greek world, where many different city-states made alliances or warred against each other, yet also recognized their common Greekness. Likewise, though there were various tribal kingdoms in Britain, and they often fought with each other, when faced against a common enemy, many of them instinctively united. Events like the invasion of Julius Caesar between 55 and 54 BC, and later with Claudius in 43 AD, show that the vast majority of British kingdoms united their forces in order to defend the island from outside invaders. Though more distant from the well-known political power centers which engaged politically with Gaul and Rome, Iron Age Wales was not a backwater. It may even have been the spiritual heart of Iron Age Britain. The remains of a massive man-made hill fort and palatial complex still stands along the northwest coast of Caernarfon, Dinas Dinsay. From its top one can see the island of Anglesey, Ynys Môn in Welsh, where the Druids were said to have concentrated after the Roman invasion. Over the past 2,500 years, the sea has claimed about 50% of the site, but it's estimated that in its original state, it may have been one of the largest Iron Age sites of its kind in Britain. Its name means Fortress of Lug, or Lugus, a frequent name for fortification sites across the ancient Celtic world, highlighting the god's martial nature, which features in surviving myths among the Cymru and the Gaels. One aspect that set the Britons of Iron Age Wales apart from their cousins in England or Scotland is that they did not seem to have used much pottery, suggesting a distinct regional culture. We know of several tribal groupings from the region of modern Wales during the time of Roman contact. One was the Demetai, from which we get the later Welsh name Dyfed, which occupies the same region as its ancient progenitors, and in myth was ruled by Pwyll, the lord of Dyfed, who once changed places with Arawn, the lord of the underworld. The Silures were to their east, and Romans remarked that in appearance they looked far more like the Gauls or Spanish, evidence perhaps for the larger mainland Celtic immigration into the region. To the north were the Ordovices. Caratacus, the chief of the Catovalani, gained refuge among them after his defeat in the east, and led both the Ordovices and the Silures in war against the Romans for almost a decade, until his betrayal at the hands of Cartmandua of the Brigantes. After the fall of southeastern England to the Romans in 43, it took decades and numerous Roman military campaigns to subdue the Welsh kingdoms. According to the Roman historian Tacitus, the Druids of Britain had gathered at Anglesey after the conquest of southeastern Britain. The Romans believed that they were instrumental in mounting a united resistance to their rule and led an assault against them. This major Roman venture into Wales was cut short by the rebellion of the Iceni led by Boudicca, and it would not be until 78 AD that the Roman conquest of Wales was completed. The Romans established numerous forts in Wales, which formed the basis of several important towns. Caerleon, for example, began as a fortification for the Second Augusta Legion after they had conquered the Silures in 74. Other Roman sites, like Tomini Mir, feature in Welsh medieval tales. In the Mabinogi, before Say became king, he was given rule of Ardudwy, an old local name for Tomini Mir, the remains of a rather isolated Roman fortification. All the events of the tale can actually be mapped out to nearly the exact places mentioned in the story, including the hill from which first Gronu and then Say cast his spear, which broke through the stone. The Roman conquest left clear marks on the geography of Wales as well as the minds of the people. The Welsh name for the British people, Brython, actually comes from a Latin rendering of the Brythonic Prytany, which became the Welsh word Prydain, referring exclusively to the Picts. In other words, the British of southern England by the time of the Roman abandonment of Britain had come to see themselves to some extent through the lens of the Romans. They were not exactly Romans, but they were changed. They were not identical to what they once were. This is the effect of long-term colonization. The Roman Emperor Magnus Maximus, though short-lived, played a crucial role in the formation of the Welsh and Breton identity, and is preserved not only in legend, but as a founder of numerous royal lines in medieval genealogical tracts. A Welsh legend called the Dream of Maxen Ulidic praises him as the wisest and best emperor that had ever lived. He has a dream where he sees a great and powerful lord with the most beautiful daughter in the world, and he falls in love with her. It turns out that this man is Eadhyf, the son of Caradoc, and king of Britain, who resides in a great castle at Caernarvon, and his daughter is Helen. Maxen goes to Britain, and Eadhyf gives his daughter to Maxen, who agrees to give rule to him over all Britain. When Maxen is ousted as emperor, Eadhyf's two sons, Cynan and Adeon, help lead the war effort to reclaim his rule, conquering all the way to Rome. When the war is over, Cynan remains in Gaul and founds Brittany. The concept, down to the details of the dream, show it to be of ancient Celtic origin. It has direct parallels to Irish mythology. Eadhyf is the high god of heaven. His daughter, or sometimes wife, is the goddess of sovereignty, whom he bestows upon the king. And his two sons are the twin sons of heaven, who give aid to the king in battle. almost to the exact same tale as mentioned in a Welsh triad concerning two sons of Arenrod, there named Gwanar and Gwynwynwyn, elsewhere named Thay and Dylan, who lead the armies of Caswallawn in a conquest of the Roman Empire. This can be directly compared to Greek mythology, where Zeus is the father of Helen and her two twin brothers, Castor and Pollux. There was also such a connection made in some Irish sources between the Dioscuri, Helen, and the god Lugh. The provided genealogy calls Evdiv the son of Caradog, while in the Harleian genealogy it says Thay hen map Gwyddgen map Caradog, meaning Thay, the son of Gwydion, the son of Caratacus, showing that though the names may be different, there are underlying parallels that cannot be a coincidence. Maximus may have played an oversized role in Welsh legends, because he may have been the emperor who returned local rule to the British. It may even have been at this time that the initial British kingdoms were established, of which Gwynedd, Powys, and Dyfed, and the northern kingdoms like Rheged, are but a few that we know of. While the post-Roman political structure in Britain is unclear, it is very likely that some type of political arrangements were made, and that Emperor Maximus may have had a hand in that organization. When Maximus left Britain, many of the garrison troops left with him, never to return. Just as in the legend, it's believed that some of these troops were of British origin, and that these soldiers may have ended up settling in the region of Brittany, leading to the legend of Cynan. With the onset of the Saxon invasion, many more Britons would follow them out of the country, fleeing to Brittany, and even to some locations in Spain. Their legacy is still present in Brittany, home to one of the surviving Celtic languages of the Brythonic branch. By the time Rome left Britain, much of the elite of the southern part of the island had become, like in Gaul, very Romanized. All the elite would have been fluent in Latin, and the language left its mark on Welsh also. At least some of the British elite had come to think of themselves as Romans. For those in the north or in the far west, like Wales, the situation on the ground was likely very much different than in London. Though the elite there also spoke Latin, the region was far less influenced by Rome, and this can also be seen in archaeology, where many of the common people lived lives very little different as those from before Claudius ever sailed across the channel with his elephants. It may have been this un-Roman lifestyle of the provincials that allowed these areas to cope better with the Roman retreat, and to withstand hundreds of years of bitter conflict that followed. Though geography also plays a critical part, being further from the eastern channel crossings and partially shielded by mountainous terrain. Gildas, a Welsh monk, Grumpy Gildas as I call him for his constant berating of his countrymen, tell us that most of the Britons rejoiced when the Romans left, happy to return to their barbarism. This may well have been the view of common people of Wales, who were happy to be free of taxes, and many others who were still pagans at the time, unhappy with the Romans having shuttered their temples. Gildas viewed even the Welsh Christians as bad Christians, living in heresy, and this was a view shared by later English and Irish clergy. The details about this Welsh Christianity are not precisely laid out, but they are often accused of Pelagianism, and some believe that Pelagius was from Wales, although possibly Ireland. A flavor of that Christianity can be tasted in some of the medieval Welsh poetry, often ascribed to Taliesin, although more likely written by bards who were invoking him and were possessed by his poetic spirit. I have been with skillful men, with Mathe and Govannon, with Einith and Elistron, in company with Achwison, for a year in Caer Govannon,
I am old, I am young, I am Gwion, I am universal, I am possessed of penetrating wit. Thou wilt remember thy old Brythun, and the Gwyddel, kiln distillers, intoxicating the drunkards. I am a bard. I will not disclose secrets to slaves. I am a guide. I am an expert in contests.
Though these sentiments are presented also in Irish works, they reach a certain mystical perfection in the early medieval Welsh poetry. Taliesin, or these bards writing as him, were not lone cranks, but performed their work in the halls of lords and were greatly honored, despite promoting a mixture of pagan and Christian mystic ideas. Of course, the biggest event, the most important by far that shapes the identity of the modern Welsh, is the Anglo-Saxon invasion. Welsh legend says that they were invited in by a foolish and corrupt British king, Vortigern. After the Romans left, they were suffering greatly from raids by the Picts and Scots, and so they recruited Saxon mercenaries who, when realizing the British were vulnerable, turned on them. There is likely some truth behind this legend, but those Saxon mercenaries may have been in Britain before the Romans ever left. Germanic soldiers, including mercenaries, served the Roman administration in Britain. This can be proved by Roman period inscriptions bearing Germanic names. An altar dedicated to Mars Thingus is known in Britain, Mars of the Assembly, likely an epithet for the Germanic god Tyr, or Tiw in Old English. Saxon mercenaries were likely brought on by the Romano-British administration to help curb raids of their fellow tribesmen, and they likely continued on in Britain after the Roman troops pulled out. Maximus's withdrawal did not clear out all Roman troops and auxiliaries from Britain, though. Men were still garrisoned at Hadrian's Wall, for instance. There is some evidence that Stilicho, the half-German de facto caretaker emperor, launched a retaliation against the Picts between 396 and 398. But in 402, facing down the might of the advancing Visigoths, Stilicho recalled to the mainland the garrison of Hadrian's Wall. The local administration still had some troops positioned in cities and forts, but these soldiers were now no longer receiving money from Rome, nor were any mercenary forces that may have been employed. These troops may have gone years without receiving official compensation, possibly being supported by local governments or even acting as bandits themselves. By 406, the troops in Britain were in open revolt. In 407, they declared Constantine III emperor. We know nothing about his background, but it is even possible that he was a Roman born in Britain, in one of the Roman colonies there. He and the remaining troops in Britain crossed the Channel and fought to halt the Germanic invasion into Gaul. The Roman forces in Gaul supported him, and he actually did become emperor. But like most during that period, he was dead before the close of 411. It's possible that he was a Romano-British emperor, having been born and raised in Britain, though probably to ethnic Roman parents. Yet in all this chaos and the withdrawal of all major Roman forces from Britain, at a time when they were facing disastrous raiding, certainly must have spurred the administration to find some means of defense. It's entirely believable that Saxons who had been serving the Romans and had already settled along the coastal defenses of Britain were kept in the employ of the now adrift Romano-British administration, as their weakness became increasingly apparent, and possibly their ability to pay expired. These mercenaries decided to take land instead of gold, and rather than repelling their cousins, invited them in to expand their settlements and wrest control from a crumbling administration, just as their Germanic cousins had been doing throughout Gaul and Italy at the exact same time. By the year 410, Greek historian Zosimus said of the situation in Britain, "They rejected Roman law,
reverted to their native customs, and armed themselves to ensure their own safety.
The Emperor Honorius may have responded to a British request for aid against the Saxons in the same year, saying they would have to manage their own defense. Given that in 410 Rome itself was sacked by the Visigoths, there was in fact nothing the Roman administration could do to help Britain. They were now well and truly on their own, facing the same massive challenges that all those across Western Europe faced at that time: migrants. Starting even before the Romans officially left Britain, but greatly accelerating thereafter, constant raiding was making trade and advanced economic activity in the country almost impossible. The cities of Britain were now cut off from their economic lifeline and became depopulated. London went from being the biggest urban center in the country to being almost totally depopulated. Colchester, another important center, had fields within the city walls, and many other cities across Britain were entirely or mostly abandoned at this time, as people fled to the countryside in order to scrape together a living from the soil. In the east, Saxons were flooding in, and not only pillaging the land, but grabbing lands and building up kingdoms of their own. Initially, it's possible that the first settlements were actually given by the local administration as a form of payment, but gradually they expanded by force. Along the Welsh coast, Gaels were raiding and settling as well. Massive numbers of British at this time decided that all was lost. They took whatever they could on a ship and set out for Brittany, or even the more exotic Spain, where small British colonies established themselves in this period of pure chaos. It was in that almost unimaginable period of darkness and desperation that the legends of King Arthur emerge. There are many different views on Arthur. My own view is that he is largely the creation of legend, a compilation of real kings and war leaders, mixed with ideas originating in British pagan mythology. Such is often the case with folktales about historical figures, even in modern times. One historical figure he certainly merges with is Aurelius Ambrosius, who is mentioned by Gildas and identified by Bede and Nennius as having led the Britons in the Battle of Badon Hill, where he is credited with stopping the advance of the Saxons for a time. Later histories switch Aurelius for Arthur, or say that Arthur was Aurelius's key knight. Geoffrey of Monmouth creates a mythical tale about Aurelius, known as Emrys in Welsh, which seems to combine him with tales of Merddin Wyllt, and in some Arthurian tales he becomes the brother of Uther Pendragon, father of Arthur. The further in time one moves away from the time when Arthur is said to have existed, the more one hears about him from so-called historians. This is very likely because folktales spreading among the population about this period had popularized a figure that they called Arthur, and this was so widespread it was generally believed, especially as there are no written records from this time. His legend mirrors that of a number of European gods, and in his earliest tales, he is often directly associated with pagan gods or even has them in his retinue. Though likely not ever a living person, the idea of Arthur became an important expression for the great heroes and kings during that hazy time when the existence of the British people balanced on a knife's edge. Later kings, especially kings of Welsh origin, claimed to trace their lineage to him. Chosen by heaven, he was believed to have united all the Britons, from the Old North to Cornwall, in a common struggle against the Saxons. During that period, something like this must have occurred, with even grumpy Gildas claiming that the Britons were able to unite and halt the Saxons, even retake some lands. Yet it was not to last. With the fall of our historical Arthurs, the Saxons would continue their push west and north. By 600, the Saxon kingdom of Northumbria conquered the British kingdom of Godolphin, whose centre was at Edinburgh. Their defeat is memorialized in one of the earliest Welsh poems called O Godolphin. One of the earliest kings of Gwynedd had moved to Wales from the north, and the connections were especially strong between them. The Battle of Chester in 616 saw the fall of another northern British kingdom, that of Rheged, also highly memorialized by the medieval Welsh bards. This victory seems to have severed the Welsh from their northern brothers, such as the British kingdom of Strathclyde, which continued for several hundred years before being absorbed into the kingdom of Scotland. In the south, they were already cut off from a land connection to Cornwall, but by this time there was already a growing sense of the Cymru as isolated from other British people, increasingly sealed off by the Saxons. This sense soon became a reality with the creation of Offa's Dyke. It was a massive defensive dike that ran nearly the entire length of Wales, north to south, roughly matching the borders as they exist today. It was named after a powerful king of Mercia who ruled between 757 and 796. Though there is some argument if the date of the wall actually matches this period of Offa, historical accounts from roughly the same time attest to it, and it matches the Powys-Mercian border and makes the most sense. Offa's Dyke is nonetheless the most massive construction undertaking of the period, being 152 kilometers long and up to 65 feet wide. Just as Hadrian's Wall had a mental effect on the Picts, Offa's Dyke may have imposed a similar idea on the Cymru. They were sealed off behind a barrier in what used to be their own land. But the Cymru didn't accept any of these events as passive spectators. This overview misses the many battles that were being fought all through this period, the raiding of territories back and forth. But by 800 AD, the Anglo-Saxons had pushed the Welsh to near their current boundaries. Many blame the disunity of the native Britons for their failure to repel the Anglo-Saxons, but we have to have a broader perspective here. The Anglo-Saxons themselves were not unified until much later, for instance. Instead, a number of factors seem to have come together that disadvantaged the Britons. The disorganization during the collapse of the Roman Empire meant they were politically unprepared. The Romanized elite in the southeast seem to have been less interested in fighting. In part, this sentiment can be seen in the mass flight of the population to Brittany. Finally, the numbers of Saxons who were coming into Britain may have been far more massive than some had previously suspected. Recent genetic studies suggest that, contrary to some previous theories, there was in fact a very large population turnover in southeast England, which saw most of the population there replaced by Anglo-Saxons. As one moves west, those numbers decrease, with more blending with the local population over time, but there can be little doubt that the Saxons came in very large numbers, likely comparable to the mass migrations of Goths, Lombards, Franks, and others who took over Italy and Gaul and Iberia. If even these places could not withstand the Germanic migration, we can look at how the native British were able to manage it as a great success. In 1055, Griffith ap Llywelyn became the first king to have dominion over all Wales. The English, under Edward the Confessor, recognized his claim through the influence of Griffith's close ally, Alfgar, Earl of Mercia. Yet when Alfgar died in 1062, it left the Godwin brothers, Harold and Tostig, in almost complete control of England. Angered by the earlier political interference by Griffith, and likely threatened by a politically united Wales, they gained Edward's permission to launch an attack, Caught off guard, Griffith only just managed to escape by ship the advancing armies of Northumbria and Wessex. The Godwin brothers managed to win the submission of the other Welsh lords within a year, and Griffith was forced into hiding in the mountains of Snowdonia. An Irish account says that he was killed there, betrayed by a fellow Welshman who held a grudge against him for having had his father executed 20 years earlier. His head was sent to Harold as a trophy. Though Harold had conquered Wales and gained hostages from the lords, he restored the traditional kingdoms, creating a once again divided Wales, which swore to give homage and loyalty to the English crown. Thus, while defeated, they retained most of their political autonomy. The English victory was certainly far from long-lived, however. By the close of 1066, just 3 short years later, Harold was killed in the Battle of Hastings, and the Normans ruled over England, but not Wales. While England fell to the Normans, Wales continued in independence. Attempts were made to take Wales, but it wasn't until 1094 that most of Wales came under Norman control, and this control was tenuous. As much as the Welsh may have disliked the English, they seemed to despise the Normans as brutal thugs. In 1101, the Welsh began a rebellion, in part under the leadership of King Griffith ap Cynan, who had escaped a Norman prison where he had spent 11 years. Through warfare, uprisings, and negotiations, the Welsh managed to regain political control over much of Wales. In 1157 and 1165, renewed attempts to subdue the Welsh were made by King Henry II, but each was unsuccessful. By 1277, Wales was again moving towards a situation of political unity. The princes of Gwynedd had managed to secure power over the other princes of Wales, and began to take the title Prince of Wales. One of the last Welshmen to hold the title in full was Llywelyn ap Griffith. Llywelyn was an assertive leader who made enemy, including his own younger brother Dafydd, who defected to the English. Tensions between Llywelyn and King Edward I rose when the Prince of Wales refused to abide by the terms of an agreement he had signed with Edward's father, King Henry III, which had given English recognition to Llywelyn's title of Prince of Wales, in exchange for paying homage to the English monarchy. When Henry died, Llywelyn refused to turn up to a meeting to pay homage to the new king, and it was taken as a sign that Llywelyn was planning disloyalty. Unfortunately, because Llywelyn had made many enemies, and because English lords were now occupying parts of South Wales, the army Edward raised against him was around half Welsh, or even more. That doesn't mean that the Welsh wished to fight against Llywelyn. They didn't have a choice if they were called up by their lords. It might rather show that Edward wished to use the Welsh to fight the Welsh, to drive a wedge between them internally, and lose as few English troops in the fighting as possible. A cynical, callous maneuver. After about a year of fighting, Llywelyn offered a surrender, and in November 1277 signed the Treaty of Aberconwy, which left him with a small portion of Gwynedd, while Edward and Llywelyn's brother claimed the remaining. Most of Wales became either directly controlled English royal lands or English protectorates at this time. Barely anything was left of Welsh sovereignty. But in a surprise move, Llywelyn's brother, Dafydd, who had earlier sided with the English, turned against them a few years later and began a rebellion. It has been suggested that he felt cheated by what he was given by King Edward in exchange for his betrayal, but we should not altogether discount that it did not sit well with him for Wales to be under direct English rule. Certainly it was a sentiment felt by many. Their entire history since the fall of the Roman Empire had been about resisting Saxon rule, and now they had finally succumbed. Together with many lords throughout Wales, their uprising turned into a national struggle. It wasn't long before Llywelyn joined the fight as well, despite what must have been the deep sense of betrayal he held for his brother. They initially scored some big victories against the forces of Gloucester, but when Llywelyn was lured into a trap and killed during the Battle of Orwyn Bridge, it took a bad turn. In June of 1283, Dafydd ap Griffith, now the heir to the title Prince of Wales after the death of his brother Llywelyn, was captured, sent to Shrewsbury, and executed as a traitor. The military resistance to England was crushed. Though the lands of Wales were not incorporated into England at this point, all sense of Welsh political independence was effectively dead. There were still important Welsh nobles who were committed to maintaining Welsh culture and language and history, and who wished that they could resist the English, but they were relegated to administrators of English-controlled territories. Many of the major castles that everyone loves in Wales date to the Edwardian period. To ensure English domination over the Welsh, castles were built throughout the land, not to protect the people, but to subjugate them. Castles made it very difficult for local revolts against unpopular English lords to succeed, as peasants have little means to besiege a castle. The lands of Wales were treated as the King of England's personal fiefdom, and Edward bestowed them on his son, his heir, Edward of Carnarvon, and gave him the title, sardonically perhaps, Prince of Wales. Ever since that day, in 1301, every English monarch has done the same, bestowing the same title and rights to his or her heir apparent. Presently, that is William, Prince of Wales. The present monarchy is chosen to be a symbolic and rather useless institution through not exercising any of their power to do anything. So whether this actually has a significant impact today can be debated, but the symbolism of giving the heir apparent the title of Prince of Wales did not begin innocently. It began as an open show of force over a subjugated people whose lands were taken in military conquest by Edward, King of England. And you might think this is the depressing end you knew was coming, but it isn't. Though Wales had been conquered by the English, their history and sense of identity was too deep to be erased. Despite Edward's conquest and the creation of many fortresses of oppression, uprisings continued. The most famous and greatly successful of these took place in 1400, when the legendary Owain Glyndŵr claimed his hereditary title, Prince of Wales. Owain was not just a rebel or a noble seeking to elevate his standing, but a true patriot. He was also highly intelligent, able to win victories on the battlefield and in diplomacy. He was such a towering figure that some later English accounts describe him as a sorcerer, able to summon up storms and lightning to oppose the English forces. Shakespeare said, "He called spirits from the vast misty deep." This was the kind of impression that was left of him in the popular consciousness. With the 100 Years' War between England and France still slogging on, Owain cleverly won allies among the enemies of England who would give him aid. The French, Scots, and others were looking to unbalance the English, and Owain offered them a chance to do it through supporting an independent Wales. By 1404, through many successful sieges and decisive military victories on the battlefield, Owain Glyndŵr and the Welsh warriors once again managed to wrest control from the Saxons and restore Welsh rule. In a ceremony attended by official delegations from France, Scotland, and the Kingdom of Leon, Spain, he was officially crowned Prince of Wales. He announced an ambitious plan for an independent Wales based on traditional Welsh law, an independent Welsh church, and the building of national universities. He moved quickly to build an alliance with France, and some French troops were deployed to Wales to aid Glyndŵr. But Glyndŵr also made allies with the Saxons. He forged a bold agreement with Edmund Mortimer and Henry Percy, significant English nobles, which planned for the tripartite division of England and Wales between them. Welsh lands would have been extended far beyond their present boundaries, including regions long under English domination, but which were probably still largely Welsh-speaking at that time. Unfortunately, the war began to turn against the Welsh. The English launched an attack against them from occupied Ireland, and won control over Anglesey in 1406. By 1407, the vastly superior numbers and resources of the English were proving too hard to match, and Owain began to lose his English allies. The French were less interested in keeping up military support, as they were considering making peace with the English, and an English economic blockade of Wales was making it difficult to acquire arms. By 1409, Owain Glyndŵr was besieged in Harlech Castle. He managed to sneak out, disguised as an old man, and escaped into the wilderness with a band of loyal supporters. He continued to fight a guerrilla war, launching daring raids upon the English. By 1413, Henry offered pardons to all the Welsh, including Glyndŵr, but the Prince of Wales ignored the offer, despite nearly all of Wales having already fallen back under English control by this time. In 1415, Owain disappeared from history. While one of his associates, Adam of Usk, said that he died of natural causes, some legends say that, like Arthur before him, he sleeps in a hidden cave somewhere in the mountains, and one day, when the Cymru are most in need and looking for deliverance, he will rise again. In the Laws of Wales Acts of 1535 to 1542, Wales was incorporated into the Kingdom of England. Yet the Cymru, their language, their sense of identity, live on today. In many ways, the Welsh identity has given rise to aspects of the medieval and modern English one, in that both see King Arthur as a foundational figure, despite him being based on kings who fought against the Anglo-Saxons. After Julius Caesar, after Hengist and Horsa, William and Edward and Henry, and all the rest, they are still here. Yet the need for the return of Arthur is greater than ever. I will be watching for him. Diolch yn fawr iawn. Cymru yn byth.